as Mr. Brenda said, my assignment was on unfaithfulness and adultery. Now we know what each of those is, but just a real quick definition. Unfaithfulness is an adjective, means not faithful, false to duty, false to obligation, or false to promises, disloyal, not sexually faithful to a spouse or lover, or not accurate or complete or inexact. It's unfaithfulness. Adultery is a voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and a person who is not his or her spouse. So an adulterer is a man who has sex with a married woman, or a woman who has had sex with a married man. Each of those would be adulterous, and an adulterer is someone that's also unfaithful. So if we can actually couple those two, unfaithfulness and adultery. Now I was given two passages of scripture, which are interesting. One of which deals with conjugal infidelity, or infidelity that relates to a marriage or the relationship of a married couple, and the other passage of scripture actually dealt with spiritual unfaithfulness or adultery. Let's first talk about conjugal infidelity. We've talked about that a lot in our study, and that is in this instance, this would be that relates to infidelity in a marriage or relationship of a marriage couple. Now, the scripture Mr. Brenda gave me was Proverbs chapter 5, actually verses 1 through 23, but I don't want to read all of those because the first verses 1 through 14 really talk about the warnings that the father is giving a son, warnings against what he's called an immoral or forbidden woman. That could be a prostitute, and generally it's referred to as a prostitute. But when we get down to verse 15 of chapter 5, Proverbs chapter 5, verse 15, it says, drink water from your own cistern, meaning only have a relationship with your wife. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. You get the picture here? Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? I also want you to look at Proverbs chapter 5. In Proverbs, there's quite a bit of references to an adulterous relationship. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 through 20, and I'm going to read this from the New Living Translation. Proverbs 5, 15 through 20. Drink water from your own well, share your love only with your wife. Why spill the waters of your springs in the streets, having sex with just anyone? You should reserve it for yourselves, never share with strangers. Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. She is a loving deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you always. May you always be captivated by her love. Why be captivated, my son, by an immoral woman, or fondle the breast of a promiscuous woman? So these are warnings of an adulterous relationship. There's a couple other references I want to give you. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 26 through 29. And this is what can happen if you commit adultery. And this Solomon is writing as if he's writing to his son, but you can use the same concept for a woman. So just so it says son, it could be a woman. But let's look at Proverbs chapter 6, verses 26 through 29. For a prostitute will bring you to poverty, but here's what's significant about adultery. But a prostitute will send you to poverty, but sleeping with another man's wife will cost you your life. Can a man scoop a flame into his lap and not have his clothes catch on fire? Can he walk on hot coals and not blister his feet? So it is with the man who sleeps with another man's wife. He who embraces her will not go unpunished. So there is some danger in committing adultery. Another instance, Proverbs chapter 6, this is verses 32 through 35. Proverbs 6, 32 through 35. Warning about adultery. But the man who commits adultery is an utter fool, for he destroys himself. He would be wounded and disgraced. His shame will never be erased. For the woman's jealous husband will be furious, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation, nor be satisfied with a payoff of any size. So there are some dangers in being unfaithful or committing adultery. You could lose your life. You would be embarrassed. A lot of bad stuff can happen. And if you are married and commit adultery, just think about the damage to the relationship between you and your spouse, or if you're a woman, between you and your husband. Think about the damage of being unfaithful through adultery. What kind of damage that can cause. That the Proverbs talks a little bit about that. Now, so that's conjugal infidelity. The other scripture that Minister gave me deals with spiritual unfaithfulness or spiritual adultery. As a matter of fact, God calls the nation of Israel an adulterous woman. So let's look at that. The scriptures that she gave me were Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 15, and verses 28 and 29. Ezekiel 16, verse 15, and verses 28 and 29. By the way, idolatry, covetousness, apostasy, which is abandonment or reduction of a religious or political belief, are spoken of as spiritual adultery. So spiritual adultery would be idolatry, covetousness, and apostasy, which would be turning away from in our case, turning away from Jesus or God, and those are spoken of as spiritual adultery. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about this. We talked about conjugal infidelity. Now we don't want to talk about spiritual infidelity because the result in either case is the same, because you've got a broken and messed up relationship. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 15 and 28 and 29. And I'm reading again from the New Living Translation. But you thought your fame and beauty were your own, so you gave yourself as a prostitute to every man who came along. Your beauty was theirs for the asking. You have prostituted yourself with the Assyrians too. It seems you can never find enough new lovers, and after your prostitution there, you were still not satisfied. You added to your lovers by embracing Babylonia, the land of merchants, but you still weren't satisfied. And then if we go down to verse 32 of Ezekiel chapter 16, here's what it says. And keep in mind that what's happening is Ezekiel the prophet is saying these things, but he's speaking what God has given him to give the nation of Israel. He says in verse 32, yes, you are an adulterous wife who takes in strangers instead of her husband. Now, to know what Ezekiel is talking about, you really need to go up to the beginning of chapter 16, Ezekiel chapter 16. Now, we don't have time to read all of this stuff, but I just want to talk about some things. If you go back to find out why God is calling the nation of Israel an adulterous woman or an adulterous wife, we need to go back up and look. If we back to the beginning, looking at chapter 16 at the very beginning, the first 7 verses of chapter 16 of Ezekiel, God is telling the nation of Israel what they were like before he rescued them and made them a nation. They were like a newborn baby, it says, that had been deserted, and God came along and cared for them. I'm just going to read a few verses 4 through 7. And this was from the New King James. As for your nativity, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water to cleanse you. You were not rubbed with salt, nor wrapped with swaddling cloths. No eye pitied you to do any of these things for you, to have compassion on you, but you were thrown out into the open field when you yourself were loathed on the day you were born. And when I passed by you, O God, when I passed by you and saw you struggling in your own blood, I said to you, in your blood, live. Yes, I said to you, in your blood, live. I made you thrive like a plant in the field, and you grew, matured, and became very beautiful. Your breasts were formed, your hair grew, but you were naked and bare. So God saw this ragtag nation of Israel, this describes as a naked baby in his own blood, and cleaned them up, provided for them, and they became beautiful. Then at verse 8, he actually the picture here is that he actually married her. Now she's grown. The nation is been mature and is beautiful. He actually married her and cared for her. If you read verses 8 through 14, you'll see that. God talks about what he did for her. He adorned her, put on bracelets and ornaments and a chain around her neck, and a jewel in her nose, earrings in her ears. He fixed her up. She was looking good, right? And she became beautiful. Then as we get down to verses 15 and then 28 and 29, we see what happened. She became beautiful. That beauty became what she felt was most important. She forgot about God or her husband and became an adulteress or whore with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and everybody. So the point here is that we can and do, and the church does, commit spiritual adultery when we turn from God, and our interest then becomes things of the world. It becomes money or job or another person or whatever it is. It's more important than God, who has once saved us and two blessed us. But we are now, all the stuff that the world gives us, we go whoring after, just as the nation did, the nation of Israel did, and so they committed spiritual adultery. If you read all of the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets, you'll see all through them references to Israel being a whore, an adulteress, or committing adultery because she's broken that marriage relationship that she has had with God. God found her, cleaned her up, dressed her up, made her beautiful, married her, and then she went after any guy that she saw, meaning the nations, because that brought jewels or whatever they did to pay her. The book that speaks very explicitly about this, and Mikey, I think, gave an exhortation on this, is the example of Hosea, the prophet Hosea, who God actually told to marry Gomer, who was a prostitute, who after they married and had children, left him and went out and became and committed adultery. In Hosea, what happened though, later on, God told Hosea to go get her and bring her back. And he actually went out, paid the price, whatever the price was for her, brought her back home, and then, but you need to read the whole book. But that's an example of when we stray or commit spiritual adultery, God still loves us and will do things to bring us back to him. In the case of mankind, he sent his son Jesus to die. So if we look at both spiritual and physical unfaithfulness and adultery, we can see that there are similar things, and what causes both of those or our natural desires. If you look at Galatians chapter 5, verse 19. Galatians chapter 5, verse 19. And it says, people's desires make them give in to immoral ways, filthy thoughts, and shameful deeds. Now that's both, and that fits both kinds of unfaithfulness or adultery. The conjugal infidelity and the spiritual adultery. Usually, we think of having faith as simply trusting and believing, and that's true. But that can be incomplete if we forget that as Christians, we are joined to Christ as our bridegroom. In the New Testament, there are many references of the church being the bride of Christ and Jesus being our bridegroom. In the book of Ephesians, when Paul talks about, Paul gives an analogy in Ephesians. He gives an analogy of husbands, and it's Ephesians 5:25. Ephesians 5:25, it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So that's an analogy of Christ and the church being married. Now we're part of the church, or we are the church, so we in effect are married to Jesus. There's another reference where Paul refers to the church as a virgin waiting for her bridegroom. That's at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2 says, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, and to present you a pure virgin to Christ. He's talking about the church being married to Christ. And he uses this relationship between Christ and the church as an example of the importance of the marital relationship. So in other words, there's a real relationship with Christ that's at stake when we commit spiritual adultery or we're unfaithful spiritually. Okay? And although we don't have a legitimate reason to do that, we often betray our bridegroom. And how do we do that? This I can tell you. We know what the fruit of the Spirit is, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are fruit. But if we do these other things, if we show immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, and outbursts of anger, disputes, all that stuff that's in Galatians 5, then we are in effect committing spiritual adultery. Now the only thing that could keep us from letting our desires overtake us, because remember what I said, Galatians 5:19 says, people's desires make them give in to immoral ways, filthy thoughts, and shameful deeds. The only thing that can keep those desires under control